Sup Shredders, my name is Logan aka Spiderhands and welcome to an SP Reacts where today we have 3 tracks off of an album from an act named MaeBeaNot titled The End Never Leaves. And if we switch over to here, we have the first of the 3 tracks for today. These are the last 3 off of the album. This one titled All Over Again. We're going to listen through this track as well as 2 others from start till finish, and we're going to hear what we think. Let's go, All Over Again. What have we got? It's a little bit disconcerting, isn't it? That's a famous piano piece. Creative use of sampling there. And then to move away from that with these ghostly textures is kind of weirdly exhilarating, to be honest. I mean, just the sound of the wind there, almost like it's a pad. I mean, the reverse piano takes here are beautiful. I'm not sure if it's a continuation of the previous piece we had at the start or not, but I mean, to be honest, that was stunning. We're just going to talk about the track more in a moment. I just need a moment to think about it. So that's the first track for today, titled All Over Again off of the End Never Leaves album. So this is an instrumental, so there's not really a story that's being told literally by a vocalist. But what I can kind of ascertain from listening through it is that this track could be about someone who is like learning pieces on the piano, like classical pieces. Maybe they grew up doing that kind of music. And then they kind of move away with that after doing it for a bit, and they realize actually they want to sort of make more sort of noise or experimental stuff. And so they're kind of going between the piano playing and the noise and going back to trying to sort of like play the keys and make it a bit more sort of like melodic, and then sort of like ripping away from that again. They're contrasted even with the distortion on the piano keys, which I'll talk about in a moment, but I think that's my kind of interpretation of it. And the beauty of instrumental music is that you're often left with that flexibility and freedom, which I appreciate. One of the things I really enjoy about this piece is the interesting sort of like tones on the keys. A lot of the time people are very sort of like focused on making the pianos sound pretty, but you can also do whatever the heck else you want with them. And in this instance, we kind of make them sort of stuttery and glitchy sounding. We cut the notes. It almost becomes like an ambient texture by itself, even though you can follow along with it. There's enough of the piano present, at least in that starting bit, for you to sort of become involved with it and understand where it's going, but not enough that it doesn't sound like someone's sort of like chopping up a vintage tape. For that sort of like come away from that and add those kind of glitchy, windy textures on the sides and sounds of really sort of like experimental, kind of almost, again, noise effects oriented stuff is a really interesting contrast. And it creates a nice bit of flavor and color when it enters, whilst not trying to sort of steer the ship too much. As we go later on to the piece as well, the keys continue, but they have a more sort of like fluid feeling to them, which maybe represents more certainty about the specific thing we're making there. The reverb tails that we have on those keys sort of makes you think that it's a more deliberate one. It's sort of smoother and maybe sort of more well connected to the whole notes of the other sort of synth ambient pad textures and some of the colder, windier elements. But I think that having the different treatments of the different piano parts as well and different things ultimately just does make for a more sort of like varied experience. I think also the fact that there is no set structure to this makes it far more intriguing. You're left wondering where you're going to go next when there's no precedent set. And I think that especially with kind of ambient or experimental music, that is a given, right? But it can go into the realm of being almost nonsensical or, just a little bit too opaque for some listeners if you don't kind of give them something to cling on to. So while we had sort of certain elements and layers that you go, okay, I understand what's going on there, we're playing a thing. It does tie together a lot of the kind of colder, more mechanical or more sort of otherworldly sort of implements that kind of just create a really intriguing, unique fusion. I also think it's the studio production. I try not to come on that too early when I'm checking out multiple tracks from an album, simply because you never know how the rest of it's going to go. But I feel here just the use of the reverb textures and kind of like more kind of ghostly elements there, adding a bit of sizzle on unexpected parts. It's doing things that are deliberately trying to push the boundaries of what you would expect from these different layers. And I like the fact that we kind of had like a faux lead element whilst having the stereo field filled with a lot of interesting ingredients within the mix there, and stuff wasn't just sort of stagnant or sort of static. It would kind of go to the sides and it would kind of move around like that and do a lot of interesting things. Things would flutter. There would be like automation and changes of the volume of perception of certain things, whether that be envelopes or in post. And there's also a nice amount of dynamic range to it as well. Even though there's a harshness to certain elements, they never get too loud to the point where it's completely abrasive. So I think it's kind of a nice sort of cold open for people who want to hear more of this. So we're off to a good start. But we have Linger, track number 2. Kind of a weird sweetness in this. It's hypnotic, isn't it? The shudders in the low end are fascinating. And you could easily kind of fall asleep to certain parts of this. Not that it's uninteresting, but it's just, you know, it's very peaceful in certain parts. Maybe not this part, though. See, you kind of get lost in it. You get lost in it a little bit, eh? I mean, it's just the end of it. It's testament to their capacity as a musician. I'm impressed by that. So I think that was Linger. Not track number 2, to be fair. It's like track number 9 off of the album. So if you see me saying track 8, track 9, and track 10, it's not that I don't know how to count. It's that I'm sort of going by the actual sort of album itself, you know. But if we talk about Linger for a moment, I think that after the sort of, again, the mesmerizing fluctuations and almost arpeggios of those earlier sort of synth layers, the sequences, you're kind of left in a period where like you kind of get sucked into it and you feel it's incredibly calm, and it's such a pleasant track to listen to. And part with that, it almost maybe represents the feeling of kind of just wanting to linger with a certain feeling or sensation once a lot of the sensory kind of overload is gone. I'm not quite sure. It was another one of those tracks where I feel one of its strengths was the use of space. So much like the other one, but maybe even more sort of like purposeful in this one, the last bit of the piece, they play around with the frequency spectrum to have less of an emphasis on the higher end as you go. And what happens is as you slowly move down there, you're kind of like getting very, very used to the feeling of it descending to a almost point where as a listener, at least for me personally, you kind of just remain in that sort of like really chilled out sense of mind. I think that a lot of the time with music nowadays, a lot of people are just trying to get your attention constantly. Music is very kind of, hey, look at me. But with this kind of stuff, it kind of invites you to be a part of it in a way which is weirdly gentle, despite some of the harsher, the more kind of like grainy, glitchy textures that we have at certain components. I think this is a little bit, how do I describe it? It's almost like you either have like a push down in the low end there with kind of thuds and shudders and stuff like that, or you're kind of oscillating at the top there and you're kind of going between those two trios until you get to the point where you can kind of sleep along to it. But yeah, I feel like not knowing when to sort of like push things in both the composition and production side of things and when to sort of allow things to be a bit more kind of I suppose, linear, even if it's at a downturn or a longer end of the bell curve, is smart. I don't know how else to describe it other than that. I just feel like we don't even necessarily need any sort of like lead layers in a track like this to make it compelling. I think it's also just the unconventional sounds that we have there, like just those little shudders that I mentioned when we were listening through it. It's not a common thing. You'll find people in instrumentals often use instruments, for arguably obvious reasons. But I think that in music you can use sounds as well as a specific note choice to create a sense of mystery, but also to kind of make it almost seem a bit more sort of like dramatic or cinematic. So it kind of sounds like a film score to a horror movie in certain elements there. And I think that is actually a compliment in the sense that it distinguishes from maybe an emphasis on musicality through a lot of other composers. Not that it's a kind of a competition, it's just more that when I listen to music, I want to be able to remember it. And with the tracks that we've heard so far, for me personally, I feel like I'll remember this music, and that's awesome. That's the way to sort of make it in the industry, I feel, is to be memorable, at least in part of it, and hopefully for the right reasons. I think it's also just giving a shout out to the actual synth design, not just the sounds chosen, but also the difficulty of getting these different noises to be the way they are. I have probably more than a passing understanding of how synths and other related instruments work, and I can tell you that it is not simply a matter of going to a preset and plugging it in. And not that I'm trying to be disparaging in that regard, it's just part of it is also how we couple them with, like, again, reverse takes and reverbs and delays, and how we manage the dynamic range of the piece. But it's simply knowing how to affect the attack, the envelopes of certain things, how to set the LFOs, what types of sort of waves to use, how to sort of like make everything kind of tick along in a way where it does exactly what you need it to, especially if this is being done somehow like via analog stuff. It's just the actual knowledge required to be able to make music like this may not seem like a lot, but it really is. It's difficult to make stuff like this. You have to really know what you're doing, and I'm thankful that we've put that much effort into this music. But finally, for the last track of today, we have Untitled. Let's go. Vocals with heavy modulation. Kind of sounds like a guitar in the background. I know this is me just discussing what I'm hearing, but surely that would be like feedback or something, or Strymons. I mean, the video design is... I like how responsive it is to the music. Kind of sound like a train for a moment. So that was pretty wild. Not gonna lie. Not gonna lie. We're gonna talk about this track more in a moment, and then we're gonna do the conclusion. So Untitled from MaeBeaNot. It's a fitting end to the album. I think what it comes down to is simply just a pure expression of self. Whatever they wanted to sing, with the heavy sort of like modulation and filtering on their vocals there, messing around with the intensities of that regard with the different knobs and stuff, maybe with some of the, maybe the guitar takes with the just a heavy treatment there, just kind of whittling them down to sort of lower end and kind of raising them a little bit and kind of affecting the attack or the speed at which you hit the notes. It goes right instead of brum. There are a lot of really cool ideas that are presented here that I think epitomize the album from what I've heard as a whole. This is, again, it's pure expression of self. I'll talk about that in the overall conclusion, but one of the things I think is done well here, as well as the other tracks, and I'll talk about this I suppose in a moment as well, it's just the how arrhythmical it is. It's not got a core central groove to it. It's very much kind of oh, you have this thing doing this pace, this thing doing that pace, and they don't necessarily want to behave with one another. They just do whatever they like. It's almost like the free expression of all these different ideas are put forward in a way where they're not meant to sort of like go online. It's very much kind of, this goes here and oh, if it happens, what will occur? And when it almost sounds like we're, approaching it from a beginner's mindset, simply from the perspective of someone, a lot of the time when you do music for a while, you get stuck in little ruts and you have to kind of find ways to break out of that in order to continue to evolve. We don't have that here. It's simply we're doing whatever we want, and it's its own unique experience. So I think that the arrhythmical element, though, how we have some things at different speeds, like the train that we had a bit later on, other sequences go blah, blah, blah. Even tempo is non-existent within this. I think that adds to the kind of fascination of it, because it just does make it sort of purely unpredictable. I do think, though, that crescendo near the end of the piece there, then we kind of built up to a finale, and then we kind of petered out and kind of whooshed away. That was smart, because it kind of infers that maybe the entire journey we've had is leading up to this moment, to the where we simply just don't even want to sort of give it a title, we just want to let it be. And then it kind of rises to that with the vocals, and then boof, we're done. And it's almost like you can imagine the celebration the musician is having completed the work. In its purest form, it sounds like an ending to an album that doesn't necessarily have a set structure at this point. It's simply you've had this ether that you've been surrounded in for X amount of time, and then it's over, and you're like, whoa, what happened? Time flew by. And I think that's the strength of it as well, is the final comment I'll make is that with songs like this, they simply give you enough to kind of go, it's like you're going through space, or you're having a dream or something like that, and these little things pop up at certain parts and different sort of like sections, which I suppose provide a sort of faux structure to it. But you're kind of almost able to sort of take what you want, pick and choose. And that's a smart thing, because it doesn't try to emphasize one thing necessarily over a lot, unless it's deliberate parts like the piano, I suppose, or the vocals here. But the little kind of glitches or glows are sort of like loops of things in the elements there. The way that you still have this kind of under kind of like bass kind of pulse to it, and things sound like they're writhing a little bit occasionally, is almost designed from the outset to get you used to that. So that again, when you do have that big crescendo at the end, it's like, oh wow, we're going up here. And there's moments on the other tracks where it's been similar to this. It's just, I feel like it really does provide a lot. It's just not one main idea. It's all these other ones, and they kind of seamlessly integrate without necessarily meaning to. But we're going to talk about this album more in the conclusion. And so welcome to the conclusion of my review of these tracks off of an album from an act named MaeBeaNot, the album titled The End Never Leaves. Now, I've spoken about each of these 3 tracks today all over again, Linger as well as Untitled, and their individual little sort of mini conclusions. So if you want my thoughts on the individual tracks, I recommend going through checking those out. But ultimately, what is this album about? So I think this album is about someone who is going through stuff. And I know that sounds so basic, but with the lack of sort of lyrics being an instrumental album, it really does kind of force you to interpret things the best way you can. I mean, All Over Again is about someone, I think, like trying to do things like play music and then going back to the noise and then doing several loops of that. So maybe it's basically inferring that we're trying to do things a certain way, but we have like a thing we actually need to do. Linger is you have the kind of sweetness of certain kind of oscillated sort of like synthesizers or loop synthesizers and arpeggios there before we go near the end to maybe the feeling of just kind of being stuck with it. So maybe we had this sweetness and we're kind of left there at the end, either quiet because we've been satiated or maybe quiet because we want more. And then ultimately with Untitled, it kind of sounds to me like it's about someone saying, oh, okay, I'm trying to voice myself, because there were vocals in that one. It's basically saying, hey, I want to speak out and I can't. And then like the noise returns, and then there's this big crescendo near the end where there's maybe some guitar takes and stuff in between, but the voice rises with the crescendo, and then boom, things peter out, but it doesn't sound resolved. So if I was going to tie those together, The End Never Leaves, I'm not sure what The End Never Leaves means, but if I was to take the story I got from this, it's someone who is sort of trying to get their needs met, trying to do things the right way, ultimately sort of like cries out near the end, but then things aren't sort of concluded. So maybe we just can't find the end of the chapter that we're looking for and need a new sort of like angle, and we're just not necessarily sure what's going to happen next, whether we're going to be able to overcome it or not. It's an interesting tale though regardless. I probably interpreted it incorrectly, but that's my sort of take on it. So if I was going to talk about stuff within this album that I liked, I think part of what I appreciated about this album with overall comments is the sound design. So I thought that it was really cool to have those pianos at the start there with like playing those classical pieces there really well, but it was the treatment of them and how sort of like unique they were, and the fact that a lot of music tries to sort of make things sound very pretty, and within the context of this piece, especially with the other sort of like instruments being rather sort of synthetic or distorted or kind of gritty or more sort of like dramatic, I think that if we had piano sounding too clean, it just would have been a little bit too distinct from that. So adding a kind of glitchiness or sort of like choppiness to it kind of makes it fit in with everything else. It shows a sense of beauty, and it helps as sort of like a pseudo lead, but you're still left in where it kind of goes into the sort of windy kind of Arctic textures on the side of the piece there, and it's like, oh, I understand it. We're going away from this now. It gets a bit cleaner later on. Maybe we're trying to do things a little bit differently there, but ultimately it's knowing how to put sounds in a piece, an instrumental one, where especially if it's not trying to sort of like instantiate set chord progressions and sort of like main melodies and stuff like that. It's where if the song almost becomes a piece of the tapestry and you're kind of rolling along with that. And then like when you have that kind of emptiness, it allows you to put another angle in and sort of almost like do sort of super sampling of elements. I think having other things such as the really sort of like hypnotic kind of synth sequences we had in Linger, they're just for a really sort of great sweetness of the tone before like returning some of those colder, harsher sort of pads and the kind of stuttering, kind of stumbling bass lines, and a low end sort of resonance there with some glitchy, uncomfortable interludes or sort of like intervals between sort of like chords that or arpeggios presented in that one, as well as again the vocals being sort of heavily sort of modulated or filtered and changing their approach or intensity, both as a production thing but also as a sound design thing, was really neat. And so it's the presentation of these elements as well as a kind of slow attack on some of the guitar parts in Untitled that sort of really kind of makes it pop off. And I love I love that we're presenting things in an unorthodox way, in a way that sort of helps separate it, because you need to stand out in the industry. This is one way to do it. I think another thing that works well within this album is a lack of structure. So I think a lot of the time with music, you can get into like a place where you feel almost regimented with your approach of how to sort of put things together, like verses and choruses and stuff like that. And the strength of instrumental music is that you don't necessarily need to have that. But within this piece, we had freedom due to the fact that we had like a smorgasbord of various things to sort of like enjoy. And I liked that because it sort of encourages the listener to sort of turn their brain off a little bit and not expect things, and sort of like open themselves up to the various things coming in and out there. They're unpredictable, and it makes it more of an exciting adventure. And I think that in order for that to work, you have to make sure that, again, the actual sounds people are hearing are ones that they would want to hear. So you need to add a sense of musicality to each of the pieces. But if you do that just enough to pique people's curiosity, you can then have that unconventional sort of like journey throughout the piece there with variations in the dynamic range and intensities of it. I think also having a lot of dynamic range within the composition itself is smart, because then it sort of says to people, hey, you need to actually listen to this. But the peaks and troughs and sort of like the arrhythmical elements of it, we don't sort of stick to a set sort of tempo or groove with different percussive instruments. I think like the closest thing we had to percussion was an Untitled with like sort of like train thing there at the end. It's all designed to kind of get you into the ether of the producer or composer's mindset, and I think it does a stellar job here. It's music that really sort of makes you think, and you can get lost in it at the same time as you're very active with it mentally. I think finally, the last thing I want to mention is the actual studio production. So I think that, you know, it's not just having that sort of lack of structure and arrhythmic, but also the sound, the textures, is also the being able to sort of like level things in a way that makes sense. It's having no weird resonant frequencies in the frequency spectrum unless I deliver it. It's adding sort of like glitchy textures to stuff when you want to have direct impact with it, and having harshness when it represents something, but also adding a bit of sweetness or kind of like serenity to certain elements there, just enough to be like, oh, we're in a nice place, and then to contrast it later on. It's knowing when to sort of filter elements to change the intensity of certain parts, such as in the end of Linger, where it became more and more sort of like low to mid oriented there as you kind of swooned out. It's having enough dynamic range for things to crescendo at the end of Untitled before they kind of peter out with the delay tails and certain things around a stereo field, as well as the automation of the panning of things around a stereo field in the Untitled part with the kind of like again, those unusual textures. And so you have all these cool sort of like concepts that are produced well, put inside a piece that is unpredictable, with like, again, it'd be nice and loud without pumping, but again, not too loud to kind of like blast the person with it. And when you have that big finish at the end, it does sound like the finish, because we haven't necessarily had those big textures until that point. And also like just having, again, those unorthodox ways of putting things forward. It's just a lot of decisions were made in the studio to make this really special. And so ultimately, I think those are three parts that I think really stand out about this album. In terms of constructive critique, I don't really have any. I think it's its own unique experience, and I think it's well worth listening to if you're a fan of this kind of music. So yeah, I loved it. Thank you for watching my review of this album, the 3 tracks of the album, titled The End Never Leaves, for an act named MaeBeaNot. These songs started all over again, lingering and Untitled, and hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, please do go show them some love via their various social medias and the YouTube and Bandcamp pages, and stay cool and stay safe, and please remember to support your local musicians and artists at this point in time, as they need the help more than ever with all the crazy stuff going on in the world. And I'll catch you in the next SP Reacts. Spiderhands out.